Good evening and welcome to part 2 of my interview with Terri Wilson, the president of the Avon Historical Society. Make sure you catch both parts because, man, woo, you don't want to miss any of that, okay? I'm James Ransom Reed Jr., your host of What's Your Story. Terri, welcome back again.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay,
Great to be here.
That's right. Let's get right to it.
Okay.
Connecticut 29th. What's that all about? Who are they? Where are they from? What role did they play in Connecticut history?
Okay, we need to go back to 1861, the beginning of the American Civil War, the war between the states.
The War of Aggression, Northern Aggression.
War of Northern Aggression. I don't say that right, sorry. I'm not from the South. I can't say that right. Yes, however you want to call it.
That's what they called it, yeah.
In our history, we know that even prior to the Civil War, there were black soldiers in the American Revolution. And even prior to that, we believe that there were black soldiers that even served in the French and Indian War. However, the most and the largest group of black soldiers who fought for our country started with the Civil War. And during the commemoration of the 150th of the Civil War in 2011, when the Connecticut Commission on the Civil War contacted all the libraries and historical societies in Connecticut, asking if they would participate in a 4-year commemoration by maybe having a few speakers, a book talk, an exhibit, blah, blah, whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
The Avon Historical Society and the Avon Public Library joined up, and we forged ahead for 4 years of having events, and we just went really deep. At the beginning of that commemoration, the Avon Library was undergoing renovations, and the library director at the time approached me and said, you know, it might be in a box somewhere, but I know that there's a record of a black Civil War soldier buried in Avon. Maybe you want to find out more for your commemoration. And I said, ooh, tell me more about that. And she says, well, I think it says his name and it says colored in 29. And I said, ooh, I don't know what that means. 2011, I was not aware of this whole story.
Sure.
So, and quickly discovered that the 29 stood for the Connecticut 29th Regiment Volunteer Infantry Colored. That was the name of it. Okay, so what is that? Many of your viewers will probably have seen Glory, the movie that came out about 15, 20 years ago. That's about the Massachusetts 54th Black Regiment.
Denzel Washington. Yes.
And a whole cast of other wonderful characters.
Yes.
Fabulous story. Well, similarly, many of the northern states did have black regiments. They were called up after the Emancipation Proclamation. Most of them formed at the very end of 1863, going off to join in 1864. So when I found out that we might have a black Civil War soldier in Avon, I wanted to know more. Quickly discovered that his name was Leverett Holden.
I just want to stop you for 1 second because our audience may not know. The Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January of 1863. What exactly did it do? Who did it emancipate?
The slaves in the South.
In the enemy-held territories.
In enemy-held territories, right.
Okay,
right.
So that's an important caveat to know that everybody was not freed.
Right.
And Mr. Lincoln had to make a military decision and say, no, we're going to free the slaves who are in captivity. Maybe they'll help us out or something. So I just think that's important.
It was, and also, as an aside, it was a manpower issue as well.
Absolutely. I mean, it was by 63.
For manpower.
By 63, they needed manpower.
Right.
Absolutely.
Not all the states were in on this, I have to say. It's interesting because even our state legislature in Connecticut was not in favor of it, although our Governor Buckingham at the time, in 1863, who was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln's, very much thought this was the way to go. Legislature voted it down several times, saying that a black man cannot be given a gun because he will rise up against the white man and he will do something to, he will harm him, which of course was not at all true. But that was the thinking at the time. It took Buckingham his own money and a lot of persuasion to get them to allow him to raise a regiment. So the 29th was literally the 29th Regiment of Connecticut men to be raised for the Civil War. The 28 previous ones were all white. They were all from all over Connecticut. So the 29th was, had enlistments in December of 1863. And Leverett, Holden, and 2 other men from Avon, well, supposedly from Avon. We're pretty sure the other 2 were not. They probably came from another town and just happened to come to Avon to register. Did enlist, And then they went off from New Haven in January of 1864 after hearing a rousing speech by Frederick Douglass, who came to New Haven to send them off, calling them the pioneers of the liberty of their race.
Absolutely.
That was the famous line
the
that
famous
he used.
phrase,
Right,
yes.
right. And we used that line in an exhibit we did about the 29th. So in diving into Leverett Holden, I discovered who he was. Found out that he was not born into slavery. He was born most likely in Vernon, Connecticut, around 1821, maybe 1826. We don't know. There's a little bit of difference there.
Yes.
He was illiterate, so he didn't really know how to, what any records there was, so he couldn't prove anything except what he thinks he knows. Anyway, so he was living in Avon. We know he came here from via Vernon through Hartford, where he worked for a period of time during the U.S. Census showed in 1850.
Wadsworth,
He
right?
was working for the Wadsworth Inn, which is a house still standing on the corner of Prospect and Albany Avenue. And that inn served until it closed right at the beginning of the Civil War. I think it was 1862 it closed. My guess is that Leverett literally just went west. And if you go west on Albany Avenue, which is Route 44, you come by what's now Bishop's Corner, you come up the mountain, you come down into Avon, and he just landed in Avon. And he lived here and worked in the community. And then when he enlisted and went off and came back in 1865, he lived his life out. And we have records of a few small records of where he lived and what he did in town. And then he passed away in 1877 and is buried in the East Avon Cemetery, which is adjacent to the Avon Congregational Church, right on Route 10 in Route 10 and where 44 come together in Avon. Can I talk about the coincidence?
Oh, please, go right ahead.
I love well, actually, it's irony. It's more irony.
Please,
the
go
whole
right
thing.
ahead, yes.
When that cemetery was laid out, and there were Revolutionary War soldiers buried in that cemetery, so we know it's a much older cemetery. When it was laid out, the spot where Leverett Holden was buried in 1877 was the last row, and he was segregated pretty far away from everybody else. And if you think of the time period, that was probably true. Somewhere in the 1930s, the cemetery configuration changed, and the entrance of the cemetery moved from the very back from where he was to the very front where he is. And now he is grave 1, row 1 of the whole cemetery. So I just think that's kind of cool that even though he was segregated in death and I'm guessing because he was black, and he is
absolutely.
pretty much segregated from everybody else. But now when you drive by the cemetery, his grave is right there in the front. So we make sure to put a flag on it every Memorial Day and take it down after Veterans Day so that we can mark it accordingly. And then the Connecticut 29th has a descendants group, and they organize themselves in New Haven. And it is a wonderful group of descendants of the Connecticut 29th Regiment who are very proud of their ancestors' role in the Civil War. And they erected a monument in New Haven at Criscola Park. And it's a wonderful monument that has all 900 names of the Connecticut 29th Regiment on these wonderful big black boulders. And the very first name is Leverett Holden, of all 900, because Avon comes first alphabetically from the towns.
Yeah.
So that is pretty cool. I'm very proud of that. So I think it's kind of great. And so I was really, I feel like I know Leverett, and
Yeah, I feel like I know him too. Yeah.
I think so too, because the reason we're talking today is because you portrayed him very recently in a cemetery tour at that cemetery, and you did a fabulous job.
Well,
so I have
thank
to
you.
thank you very much, because you brought him to life for me.
Thank you, yes.
After having studied
My
him
pleasure.
for a long time.
Yeah.
So the Connecticut 29th was a very active organization, and also what's very, very unique about them and the 54th, they share something in common. Of all the black regiments that formed from the North and fought, all of them were melded together into what was called the U.S. Colored Troops, except for 2 regiments, the Mass 54th and the Connecticut 29th. They returned to their states as a whole unit. They retained their name, and their battle flags are retained in the capitals of both buildings. And so that's a very unique thing. So we know the 54th, of course, had the movie made of them. Maybe someday we could talk Denzel Washington doing one on the Connecticut 29th. I think that would be very cool, because we do know the Connecticut 29th was present in Richmond, Virginia.
We do.
When Abraham Lincoln arrived at the end, and they were the first unit to greet him and say hello to him.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to think that Leverett was in that group that saw, and I would like to think he laid eyes on him. I don't know, because they were divided up a little bit to other units, to serve in other battles, during the time, and then they all came back to Connecticut together. So I don't know, but
he may have also been nursed by
Oh yeah, Clara Barton. That was another interesting piece. In digging in his history, I discovered that he was wounded and was treated in a what was called a flying hospital, which was kind of like, I think, MASH units. They kind of went where they had to be on the battlefield.
On the fly.
On the fly. And she served in the exact same one that he's listed as having been treated at. So she was a nurse and later, of course, founded the American Red Cross. And I would love to think that she treated him. It would just be kind of fun to know.
Be amazing, wouldn't it?
When you dive into history, you find these little nuggets and you just latch onto them.
Right.
And and when you're an amateur historian, you can kind of make up these things in your head a little bit. And like I said earlier, I love to connect dots. And this is a dot I'd like to connect some of these with him because I just think it's a very nice story and it's a good story for us. So we're very proud to have him with us.
Aren't there monuments in New Haven as well?
The monument in New Haven to the Connecticut 29th and Criscola Park is the main one that's for them. Now, in Washington, D.C., there is a Civil War, Black American Civil War Museum that has been there for quite a while prior to the Black American History one that's just opened on the Mall a few years ago. There's another one that's not far from the Mall that's dedicated just to the Black Civil War soldiers in America. And what's really neat, it's not a huge museum, but when I went to see it years ago, I walked in, and on the wall is the one photo of the Connecticut 29th, and it takes up one whole wall. And it's a regiment photo. They're all lined up in regiment formation.
Yes.
I have no idea where Leverett is in that group, but it seems to go on for miles, the picture. And they blew it up big and put it on their wall there. I stood there and I almost cried. I was like so proud that the Connecticut 29th is in Washington, D.C. there. And outside of that building, on the street, is another large monument to Black Civil War soldiers, and as many of the thousands and thousands of names they could put on there, and I did find Leverett's name on that as well. So he appears in a couple of different places, and it's pretty exciting.
It's magnificent that people never heard of this guy, you know?
No,
I mean,
and he's not written up in any books, and there are two books written by two soldiers from the Connecticut 29th. One written right after, and then one written about 50 years later, so it's more of a recollection.
Yeah.
Both of them have different stories to tell. Both became ministers later in life, and so they were leaning that way. And so that's the only really true written record of what happened day to day to them. Their visit with Frederick Douglass at the beginning, they're launching off on the boat down in New Haven, and then going off to battles in the South. Now, at the same time, what people might not realize, even though the Emancipation Proclamation was in place, there still was the law that, right now, I can't remember the name of it, Fugitive Law, I think, Fugitive Act.
Yeah,
which
you had to return the slaves.
That if they were caught in the South, they could be sent into slavery, even though they were free men from the North.
Yes.
So the motivation that they had to join up 2 years after the war starts, knowing the bloodshed that had happened at Antietam and Gettysburg and other places, knowing that they were going to be sent to the South where they could be captured and put into slavery, knowing that they were paid and offered to be paid less than what white soldiers were, knowing it was not going to be an easy job at all. What made them do it? And for a lot of them, it was really being the pioneers of the freedom of their race. I mean, really freeing their brothers and sisters in arms, in chains. And that's what it really is all about. I would love it if you would invite some members of the Connecticut 29th Descendants group to come here to tell their story. I can't tell their story because I'm not a descendant. They know their ancestors' story. They're proud of it. They will come in uniform if you ask them because that's what they do. They do reenactments. They will march in parades. They're a wonderful group of people, and I spent a lot of time with them during the commemoration of the Civil War because we helped to. They came to Avon. They rededicated Leverett Holden's grave for us, and then I met with them at the Capitol for the raising of their flags out of the cellar of the Capitol, which is where their regimental flag had been stored for the past 150 years.
That's what I wanted to talk with you about too. It's not a whole now because soldiers took pieces of it as memorabilia, but much of it has been preserved under glass, and it is at the Capitol.
It's now in the Capitol. It is in the walkway between the Capitol and the Legislative Office building. It has its own case, a large plaque explaining it. Yeah, it has the blue field and then the center design, and that was the regimental flag.
Do you know who made that regimental flag?
Yeah, I think it's called the Ball Company in New York, and a reproduction of it was made by the same company only about 15 years ago, and the Descendants group has it, and they use it when they march.
How many more Leverett Holdens are there in Connecticut that we don't know?
Oh, a lot. There has to be a lot. There's a gentleman at the State Library, Kevin Johnson, who is an employee of the State Library, who for the past about 25 years has been portraying William Webb, who was a Connecticut 29th soldier. And I've seen his portrayal several times. And if anybody in the audience has seen him, they will understand this because he does some singing, he does first-person portrayal acting,
yes.
Comes in uniform. He's just absolutely fabulous. So we know the William Webb's story. There's a lot. There's a whole lot, and only because we have one doesn't make Avon any more special. There's 10 or 15 in many different towns. We just happen to have one, and so that's why I've exploited his story because there's a story there, and unfortunately though, Leverett never married, no children. There's no descendants.
I read he was with Martha Williams.
A woman named Martha Williams, who he lived on the farm with on West Avon Road, right where our Darren house is. And don't know much about her, but he shows up in the census having living on her property. But I don't believe I don't think that was a romantic relationship. That was just, he was boarding there. Because we know the church that you go to, Avon Congregational Church, hired him, paid him $1.75 to replace some bricks in the chimney when they were doing some work.
Yes.
So that little nugget of information we have on him. We know he cut wood and stacked wood for a family on Route 44. And the Hatzels, and Mrs. Hatzel wrote that she enjoyed talking with him, liked him very much, knew that he fought in the Civil War, and so we have that little bit of information from her diary. But he didn't live very long after the Civil War. He died, not too many years later. So
1877.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So he didn't have a really long life, but he certainly had a good life, I think, and good life for the time it was, and very proud of the fact that he served. So he's one of our military veterans who we honor with a flag in the cemetery every year, as we do all the others in the cemeteries. The local VFW puts flags on all their graves.
Now, do you go to schools and do presentations on
Leverett?
different
No, I have not.
on
No,
different historical things?
No, not really. No.
I mean, because I saw your presentations that you have. My goodness.
That was for a couple adult audiences.
Oh, but that would work wonderfully.
West Avon Congregational Church asked me one time to do something, and another group
Wow.
asked me to do that. Yeah, and I've added several new slides to that because I want to add more to the story. I want to make it richer. So I am absolutely available to do that. I'd be happy to talk about my research into the Connecticut 29th, how I got there,
yes.
And then the dots I've connected, like I could talk about connecting dots. And how this all fell, kind of into my lap. But may I share my other story about how I really, early on, got interested in the Black Civil War story?
Absolutely.
Back when I got out of college almost 40 years ago, I immediately joined the Simsbury Historical Society because that's where I was living. And I got involved in a whole lot of community organizations because that's how I kept while I was working, I kept busy. And the Simsbury Historical Society, somebody there had a connection with a gentleman named John Motley, who some of your audience, if they're from the Hartford area, might know that name. He is formerly executive from Travelers Insurance Company and then became president of the Travelers Foundation and was on the Hartford Board of Education for a period of time. And I think now is running a consulting firm, so he's still in the area. And he invited several of us, so I was only in my 20s, to his home in the Farmington Valley. I can't remember which town, but anyway, went to his home to see his African-American collection. What I didn't know was that he had what is, I think, considered the country's largest collection of African-American, early African-American slavery memorabilia and items, such as shackles and cuffs and neck braces and all of this kind of thing.
My goodness, yes.
So we all got to handle, touch, see, and all these things. And I never will forget putting those on my hands, on my arms, realizing that people were, the whole story of slavery just came together with that, and I realized that. And that stuck with me. And so many years later, when, of course, I found out about the 29th, when I dove into this, that all came rushing back to me. So when we had the raising of the flag out of the cellar of the Capitol to put into the State Capitol building, I had John Motley there, and I made sure to recognize him. His collection is now with the National Park Service at the Tredegar Iron Works down in Richmond, Virginia. And I happened to be there coincidentally in 2014. Happened to walk through and see signs, and everything I'm looking at had little things they donated by John Motley, and I just thought, oh my goodness, this whole story just did a whole big circle around. You know, what goes around comes around, which is what I have said before. History goes around and comes around. Well, the same thing with my story and the Connecticut 29th and the whole Black Civil War soldiers. So why is a white woman from Avon, Connecticut care? I care because I love history. I found a nugget, and I just went with it, and I'm very pleased about it and proud of, you know, what we discovered, and I want their story to be told for real, because I don't want to make anything up. This is a real life story, and he was a real person, as were all of them. These were men who really gave a lot for this country, and we thank them for it.
Under the worst of circumstances for them, personally, like you said, you know, death on the battlefield or death at the hands of the enemy.
That's
so,
right, I know.
So,
my husband is a war veteran and from Desert Storm, and so living with a military veteran, I can certainly understand that.
Yes.
We appreciate all of us who have not served, certainly appreciate those who have served, whether it was 200 years ago, 150 years ago, or now.
Absolutely.
We wouldn't be here if we didn't have that.
No, we would not. Now, why don't we form a tag team here and go out as a group and do some things at schools about Mr. Holden or the 29th? You know, if you can help me find an appropriate uniform that I could wear, and we could go and do that. I know
that would be fabulous.
I know you saw my
Leverett.
Buffalo Soldier jacket there.
I did.
You were all
well,
over
I
me.
think let's get the descendant group here, and let's get them to, you know, give us that. Not only give them their story, but also help you get.
Help me get a uniform.
And get into the character for it.
Yeah, and I could do that. And we form a team, and you know, periodically we go to this school or that school, and you know, say maybe we have a, I don't know, 40-minute presentation, because beyond 40 minutes, you know.
There are 3 teachers in the state who I know teach the Connecticut 29th. There's one in Suffield Academy, one in Milford at a middle school. And I just found out, I think there's a private school out in the western part of the state that spends that, and they've all been in contact with each other, and I've seen their emails. So I know there's a few teachers who are doing that, and I don't know if they've had anybody come into the classroom. I think they just make sure it's in their curriculum.
Yeah.
But around this area, I'm not so sure.
Put some live bodies in that classroom.
Makes all the difference.
Makes all the difference, I think. You know, the kids will sit up and take a look.
Sure. Oh, my husband has spoken to classes on Veterans Day about his time in the service, along with other veterans currently, and it makes a lot of difference.
It makes a lot of difference, yeah.
The personal.
You know, I'm again struck by your love for history, how you just got in there in putting on Mr. Motley's memorabilia, how that brought it all home for you.
Those artifacts were so important.
Baltimore, which is my home, they have a Great Blacks in Wax Museum.
Oh.
And part of it is you go in and it's this dark area and you go down some steps like you're stepping into a ship and you see all the people shackled and the lights just flashing on them. That moved me beyond words to see that reality and to know that people still survived and people were strong and people fought still for this country to give what Mr. Lincoln called their last full measure.
That's right.
You know,
that's
so
absolutely right.
Listen, this has been like a birthday party for me, having you here.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure doing this.
You got to come back, and we got to find some reasons.
The paleo story is wonderful. I mean, I could talk about that, although I'd need to get some of the scientists involved. But boy, I've really dived into ancient history.
All right, let's do that, okay?
Okay, you're on.
Terri Wilson of the Connecticut, the Avon Historical Society. She's been here for the last 2 episodes. It's a part 1 and a part 2. Make sure you see both parts. This is James Ransom Reed Jr. I'm your host of What's Your Story? Everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time, good night.